Carolina swamps were alive with sounds no man could truly understand. Crickets sang in endless rhythm, frogs croaked in the darkness, and the air was so thick with mist that even the moonlight struggled to break through. In those swamps, the wind itself seemed to carry secrets. The slaves who lived on the plantation nearby feared the night most of all, not because of the snakes, nor the insects, nor even the overseer's whip. They feared the whispers, for when the sun dipped below the tree line, stories passed from one tongue to another in hushed tones, stories of a man who could speak to the spirits that lurked just beyond human sight. In the swamps of Carolina, whispers carried through the night. The slaves spoke of a man who could summon shadows, bend the air, and curse the soul of any master who dared to cross him. His name was never written in books, but in hushed voices, they called him the Voodoo Man. The children believed the stories, the women feared them, and the men clung to them as their only hope that justice might one day be possible. By day, the Voodoo Man was just another slave, silent, watchful, his back bent under the same burdens as the others. He chopped wood, he carried water, he obeyed orders with an expressionless face. To most, he looked like every other man trapped in chains. But by night, when the overseer's eyes turned away, he disappeared into the swamp. And when he returned, strange things followed. Cattle grew sick without reason. Tools broke, though they had been new. Overseers claimed to hear voices when no one was there. Some swore they saw strange markings carved into the trees, symbols no one could read. The master of the plantation, a man called Edward Tilling, laughed at these stories. He was a cruel man, drunk on power, and his laughter was as sharp as the crack of his whip. To him, there was no curse, no spirit, no magic, only control, pain, and the law that gave him ownership over human lives. But in the cabins, when the fires burned low, the slaves whispered otherwise. They spoke of a man stolen from Africa not just in body but in power, a man who carried with him the knowledge of his ancestors, the secrets of spirits, and the strength to call upon forces unseen. He was not broken like the rest. He did not bow in his soul. They whispered his true name had been Kofi, but that name was forbidden here. To the whites, he was just another slave. To his people, he was the Voodoo Man of Carolina. Even Edward Tilling, though he mocked, felt a tremor in his chest when the dogs refused to go near Kofi. Even when beaten, the man's eyes did not dim. Even when bled, his spirit did not fade. It was as if something deeper fueled him, something older than the plantation, older than America itself. The swamp was his temple, and the night was his shield, and so the whispers grew. Some said he could heal the sick with herbs no one else dared to touch. Others said he could summon storms with nothing more than a chant. A few swore he could look into a man's eyes and see the day he would die. But what frightened the slaves most was not what he could do for them. It was what he might one day do to Edward Tilling. Because in every whisper, in every hushed story passed under breath, there was the same ending. The Voodoo Man would be the master's undoing. The first sign came with the crops. Corn that had grown tall and proud suddenly turned black at the roots. Wheat, ready for harvest, collapsed into the dirt. The overseers muttered about bad soil, but the slaves exchanged knowing looks. They saw Kofi's hands stained with swamp mud, his eyes glinting in the firelight. Then came the animals. Horses refused to enter the fields. Cows lowed in distress, breaking fences in panic. Dogs, the master's loyal beasts, whimpered and scratched at doors, refusing to leave their kennels. And then came the dreams. Edward Tilling awoke one night, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had seen fire. He had seen his own body lying in a coffin, but when he looked down, his hands were alive. He screamed into the night, but the sound that came from his throat was not his own. He told no one. But from that night, his laughter grew harsher, his punishments crueler. He believed only one man could be responsible, the one the others whispered about. And so, in the dark corners of the plantation, the tension thickened. The slaves avoided Edward's gaze, fearful of what he might do. The overseers carried their whips tighter, and Kofi, the Voodoo Man, walked into the swamp with slower, deliberate steps, as if waiting for the day when the spirits would finally answer him. The whispers did not fade. They only grew louder. One day, the slaves whispered, the master will pay. One day, the curse will come. And deep in the swamp, under a blood-red sky, Kofi prepared. Kofi had not been born in Carolina. His story began across an ocean in the deep heart of Africa, where the earth was red, the skies wide, and the spirits lived in every tree, every river, every stone. His people had called him a keeper, one who learned the old ways, who memorized chants, who carried the secrets of the ancestors like a torch passed from hand to hand. He had been taken young, dragged in chains onto a ship where screams echoed over the waves. Many had died, but Kofi had survived, his body weakened, his spirit unbroken. They had tried to erase his name, his gods, his power, but he carried them still, locked deep in his chest like a flame hidden under ash. Years later in Carolina, he became a shadow among the slaves. Silent, watchful, strong. He never raised his voice, never bowed his head too low, never looked his master in the eye longer than needed. Yet those who knew, those who listened, saw in him something different. By night, he disappeared into the swamps. Alone, barefoot, he walked where no one else dared. The land there was thick with mosquitoes, snakes curled under rotten logs, and the smell of decay hung in the air. But to Kofi it was holy ground. The swamp was alive. It breathed, it whispered. It carried voices that others could not hear. He built a hidden circle deep within it, marked with carved bones, herbs tied with twine, and strange symbols etched into the mud. This was his temple, his refuge, his weapon. Here he spoke to the spirits, the Loa, calling on them not with fear, but with the respect of one who had always belonged to them. The slaves who followed him into the swamp came back, changed. Some said he healed fevers with a brew that burned like fire on the tongue. Others said he had pulled a curse from a child's body by chanting over her until she vomited black liquid. They feared him, yes, but they also depended on him. Edward Tilling, the master, had long suspected Kofi was not like the others. He watched him with narrowed eyes. To Edward, Kofi's silence was not submission, it was defiance. And a defiant slave was dangerous. One night, Edward decided to test him. The men were ordered into the field under torchlight, though the day's work had already ended. Edward stood on the porch, his whip coiled in his hand, his voice sharp. "Kofi," he barked, "step forward." The slaves froze. They exchanged glances, fear sparking in their eyes. Slowly, Kofi stepped from the crowd, the torchlight flickering across his face. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on Edward with a calm that unsettled everyone who watched. Edward sneered. "They say you heal the sick, that you whisper lies in the dark, that you think yourself a priest, a man of power, do you?" "Silence." The overseer shifted uncomfortably, whip twitching in his hand. The dogs whined at their master's feet, ears pressed back, their eyes darting toward Kofi. Edward's voice grew harsher. "Answer me!" Kofi did not move. He only stared. That stare, unblinking, steady, silent, carried more weight than any word could. The other slaves lowered their heads, some trembling, others holding their breath. The air thickened. Edward snapped his whip, the crack shattering the silence. "You think you frighten me with your games? I own you, boy. I own your hands, your feet, your very breath. And if I say it, I can snuff you out like a candle." Still, Kofi did not speak. But as the whip cracked again, Edward faltered. His arm trembled. For the briefest moment, he thought he saw something in Kofi's eyes. Not defiance, not anger, but something far worse. Knowledge. The master stepped back, trying to mask the unease rising in his chest. "Get back in line," he spat. Kofi obeyed. But as he melted back into the crowd, Edward felt a chill ripple through him. For the first time in his life, he wondered if the chains he carried in his hand were as strong as he had believed. That night, Edward Tilling could not sleep. His dreams were filled with shadows, with whispers, with the sound of drums that beat in a rhythm he did not know but that shook his bones. The next morning, he found the overseer's favorite dog lying dead in the yard, its eyes wide open, its tongue black. The whispers in the cabins grew louder. The Voodoo man has spoken, and though Edward would never admit it, fear had taken root. The days on Edward Tilling's plantation followed the same rhythm. Dawn's whistle, the crack of the overseer's whip, the groans of weary men and women bending under the weight of their labor. But after that night, when Edward had tested Kofi and failed to break his silence, something in the air began to change. It started small. Tools rusted faster than before. An axe that had been sharpened the day prior snapped clean in half on its first swing. Barrels of grain spoiled overnight, crawling with worms that seemed to come from nowhere. The overseers cursed the slaves, beat them harder, accused them of laziness and sabotage. But even as blood spilled, the problems grew worse. Then came the crops. The cornfields that had stretched tall and green began to turn brittle. Leaves blackened at the edges, stalks bent low as if crushed by an invisible weight. Wheat turned sour, its head shriveled and thin. The overseers tried to explain it away. Bad soil, too much rain, not enough sun. But the slaves knew better. They whispered in the cabins at night, voices hushed but heavy with certainty. The Voodoo man had spoken. Edward, furious, doubled the punishments. He forced the men to work past sunset, their bodies breaking under endless hours. The women were denied rest, beaten if they stopped to nurse their children. And yet the more cruelty he unleashed, the more the plantation seemed to wither. By midsummer, the animals joined the curse. One morning, the stables erupted in chaos. Horses screamed, kicking against their stalls until wood splintered and iron bent. The overseers rushed in only to find the animals frothing at the mouth, their eyes rolling back as if possessed. Several collapsed before noon, their bodies stiff, their lips blue. Dogs that had once followed their master faithfully now cowered when he drew near. They whined, their ears pinned back, refusing to touch the food left for them. At night they howled at shadows, their voices trembling as though they sensed something stalking the grounds. Edward could feel the unease spreading. He barked orders louder than ever, beat men and women until his whip cracked raw skin, but he could not silence the way the slaves looked at him. Their eyes carried something new, not just fear but expectation, and always in the background was Kofi. He worked as he always had, his face unreadable, his pace steady. But Edward noticed how others drifted near him, how they looked to him in moments of uncertainty, how they seemed calmer when he was close. The overseers noticed too. One, a broad-shouldered man named Harlan, cornered Edward one evening on the porch. "Sir," Harlan muttered, shifting uneasily. "It ain't natural. That man, Kofi, he don't flinch when the whip hits. He don't break down like the rest. And every time he looks at me, I swear my chest goes cold," Edward sneered, masking his own unease. "He's just a man. A stubborn one, but still a man. Chains and pain will remind him what he is." But Harlan wasn't convinced. "Then why won't the dogs go near him?" "Why do the crops die after he's walked through the fields?" "Sir, I'm telling you," Edward's fist slammed onto the railing, cutting him off. "Enough! You let superstition turn you weak. I own this land. I own those people. And I will not let shadows and stories rule my house." Still, that night, Edward locked his door before he slept. And then the dreams began again. Fire. Always fire. He saw his fields in flames, his house collapsing, his own body writhing in a coffin that refused to close. And over it all, he heard the beating of drums, deep, primal, echoing from the swamps. He would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, clawing at his chest as though something heavy sat upon it. One night, as he stumbled to his window for air, he swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the swamp. Barefoot, still, silent, the moonlight glinted in its eyes. "Kofi," Edward shouted, rage covering fear. "You, get back to your quarters!" But when he blinked, the figure was gone. The next morning, another overseer fell ill. Fever burned him, and his skin blistered as if touched by flame. He screamed of voices whispering in his ears, voices he couldn't silence. By the third day, he was dead. The slaves whispered louder now, no longer so careful to hide their words. "The curse has begun. The spirits walk among us. The Voodoo man will deliver us." And though Edward raged, though he beat and punished and cursed, even he could feel it. The plantation no longer obeyed him. His authority cracked like dry wood underfoot. The chains were still there, but their weight was shifting, and in the shadows of the swamp, Kofi prepared for what was still to come. The summer heat pressed heavy on the plantation, thick with the stench of sweat and decay. The air itself felt cursed, heavy with silence, broken only by the groans of animals and the coughs of the sick. Edward Tilling tried to keep order, but it was slipping faster than sand through his fingers. Overseers whispered behind his back. The slaves, once broken and submissive, now carried themselves differently. Their eyes lifted, their voices steadier. Fear was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer fear of him. and at the center of it all stood Kofi. It happened on a night thick with fog. The slaves had been forced to work past dusk, torches burning along the fields, overseers shouting to keep the weary bodies moving. Edward stalked the rows, his whip coiled at his side, his nerves taut like a bowstring. Then, from the direction of the swamp came a sound. Drums, slow, steady, deep. The overseers froze, torches flickering in their hands. The slaves looked toward the trees, eyes wide. Edward shouted for silence, but his own voice cracked. From the fog, a figure appeared. Kofi. He walked slowly, barefoot, a bundle of feathers and bones tied with twine in his hand. The drums echoed louder, though no one could see who beat them. Some swore they came from nowhere at all, vibrating through the earth itself. Kofi stopped at the edge of the field. His dark eyes caught the torchlight, glinting like embers. He raised his hand, the bundle swaying, and spoke in a language none of them understood. Low, guttural, filled with rhythm that rolled like thunder. The air grew colder. The torches sputtered, and then with a sudden scream one of the overseers collapsed. His body jerked as though strings pulled him, his mouth foaming, his limbs thrashing violently in the dirt. The other overseers rushed forward, but the slaves pulled back, whispering and crossing themselves. Edward stormed forward, fury overtaking fear. "Stop this madness!" he roared. "This is trickery! Nothing more!" But even as he shouted, the fallen overseer's eyes rolled white. His voice broke into screams. "He comes for you! He comes for you!" Then silence. His chest stopped rising. The field erupted into chaos. Slaves cried out prayers, overseers stumbled back, torches dropped and hissed in the dirt. The drums pounded once more, then stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Kofi lowered his hand. His voice, calm and steady, cut through the chaos. No chain holds forever. No whip rules the soul. His end will come. The words hung heavy in the night, understood by all despite the accent that colored them. Edward lunged forward, whip raised, his fury boiling over. But when he cracked it toward Kofi, the leather snapped back mid-air, curling around his own arm as though yanked by invisible hands. The pain made him stumble, and the slaves gasped. Kofi turned, walking back into the fog without a backward glance. The slaves murmured prayers of thanks, some dropping to their knees. The overseers exchanged pale looks, muttering about curses about witchcraft. Edward screamed at them, tried to rally their courage. But his voice sounded thin even to himself. That night, no one slept easily. Edward drank himself into a stupor, muttering about superstition, about breaking the African once and for all. But the overseers knew better. They had seen a man die in front of them with nothing but a word. And in the slave quarters, the whispers spread like wildfire. The voodoo man has spoken. The spirits walk with him. The master's end is near. For the first time in years, hope stirred where there had been none. And in the darkness of his cabin, Kofi sat cross-legged on the floor, arranging bones, feathers, and ash into patterns only he understood. His voice murmured prayers to the ancestors, to the spirits of earth and fire, water and sky. "The chain must break," he whispered. "The spirits will guide me. His death will not be clean. His soul will wander until justice is done." The swamp answered with silence. But silence was enough. The warning had been given. Edward Tilling could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that cursed African standing in the fog, whispering words that bent the world itself. He saw his overseer's body thrashing, the foam on his lips, the whiteness in his eyes. He smelled the stench of death clinging to his fields. He woke with his shirt damp from sweat, his heart hammering like the very drums that haunted his dreams. And every time, when silence returned, one thought gnawed at him. If he did not break Kofi, he would lose everything. The overseers were restless. Some had already threatened to leave. "This place ain't right," one muttered. "I'll not die like the others." Edward bribed them with money, promised land, swore the curse was nothing more than lies. But their fear was greater than greed, so Edward made his decision. He would show them all. He would show the slaves that Kofi was nothing but a man, flesh and bone like any other. And he would make the overseers watch as he destroyed him. The next morning, the plantation was gathered. Slaves were dragged from their quarters, lined up in the dirt with chains still rattling on their wrists. Overseers circled them nervously, torches in hand though the sun was already high. Edward stood tall on the porch of his house, his whip in one hand, a pistol in the other. "Bring him out," he barked. Two overseers shoved Kofi forward. His wrists were bound, his face calm as always. His bare feet left soft prints in the dust, his shoulders steady, his dark eyes fixed straight ahead. The slaves watched in silence, their breath caught in their throats. Edward raised his pistol and shouted, his voice sharp and brittle. This man is no sorcerer. He is no conjurer. He is a slave and nothing more. And today I will show you what happens to those who dare spread fear on my land. The overseers nodded nervously, but the slaves' faces remained unchanged, their eyes shifting between Edward and Kofi. Edward ordered a whipping post dragged into the yard. The overseers tied Kofi against it, stretching his arms wide, his back bare to the sun. The crowd waited. The air felt thick, as though the plantation itself held its breath. Edward raised his whip. The leather cracked across Kofi's back, splitting skin. A gasp rose from the slaves. Another crack, louder this time. Blood rolled down Kofi's spine, but he did not cry out. His head remained lifted, his eyes staring ahead, calm as stone. Edward snarled. He struck again and again, each blow harder than the last. The overseers shifted uneasily, sweat dripping from their brows. Still Kofi made no sound. His lips moved only once, whispering words no one could quite hear. And then it happened. The ground trembled. Not much, just a faint shiver beneath their feet. The overseers looked around nervously. Edward paused, the whip trembling in his hand. From the swamp came a rush of crows. Black wings filled the sky, shrieking and swirling overhead. They dove low, their cries piercing like knives. Torches sputtered and went out, smoke curling into the air. The slaves cried out, some dropping to their knees. The overseers tried to wave the birds away, but the flock only thickened, blotting out the sun. Edward shouted, "It's nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." But his voice cracked, swallowed by the cawing chaos. Then one of the overseers screamed. His skin erupted in boils, red and raw, his face twisting in agony. He clawed at himself, tearing flesh with his own nails. Another collapsed, choking, his throat swelling shut before their eyes. Panic spread like fire. Overseers stumbled back, tripping over one another. The slaves stood frozen, their fear mixing with awe. Edward, desperate, turned his rage back on Kofi. He pressed the pistol to his head. "You will stop this," he roared. "Stop it, or I swear I'll kill you." Kofi finally turned his head. His eyes, dark and unblinking, locked with Edward's. His lips parted, his voice soft but clear. "You cannot kill what the spirits protect. But your soul is already theirs." Edward's hand shook. He tried to pull the trigger, but the gun jammed. Smoke hissed from the barrel, the metal searing hot in his palm. He dropped it with a curse, clutching his burned hand. The crows swirled one final time, then scattered into the sky, leaving the yard in eerie silence. The overseers stared at Edward in horror. The slaves' whispers rose louder now. No longer hidden, the curse grows stronger. The spirits walk with him. The master's end is written. Kofi stood bleeding against the post, but his head was high. His presence filled the space more than Edward's shouting ever had, and Edward Tilling, clutching his scorched hand, felt for the first time that he was not the master here at all. The overseers had begun to avoid Edward's eyes. Some slipped away in the night, vanishing into the swamps rather than face another sunrise on cursed land. Those who remained carried terror on their faces, whispering prayers under their breath. Edward Tilling could feel the cracks widening. His house, his land, his power, everything was slipping from his hands like water. The lash no longer commanded obedience. The pistol no longer inspired fear, and the whispers of the slaves grew louder with each passing day. The voodoo man has spoken. The master's death is near. But Edward was not ready to surrender. He would not be defeated by superstition, not by whispers carried on the wind. He needed authority, the weight of the Lord himself, to drown out the swamp's spirits. So he sent for Reverend Josiah Harper. The preacher arrived on horseback one blistering afternoon, dressed in a black coat despite the heat, a Bible clutched in one hand. He was tall, thin, with a face carved by years of self-denial. His eyes, sharp and cold, flicked over the plantation with disdain. Edward met him at the porch, relief flashing across his face. "Reverend," he said, gripping his hand too tightly. "Thank God you've come. The devil walks among my slaves. Witchcraft. Curses. They've infected this land. I need you to drive it out." Harper frowned. Witchcraft is no small matter, Mr. Tilling. It festers where sin is strongest. If you have allowed these savages to keep their heathen practices, then you yourself have invited Satan into your house. Edward flushed, but desperation swallowed his pride. Whatever must be done, Reverend, I'll do it. I'll see this curse broken. You'll be paid handsomely. That night, Harper ordered all the slaves gathered in the yard. Torches burned in a wide circle, overseers standing behind them with muskets at the ready. Edward stood at Harper's side, his face set like stone. The preacher opened his Bible, his voice booming. Demons of darkness, I cast you out in the name of the Lord Almighty. No sorcerer, no conjurer, no heathen god shall stand before the power of Christ. The slaves shifted uneasily. Some bowed their heads, whispering their own prayers, but their eyes still found Kofi, bound in chains at the center of the circle. He stood tall, his face unreadable. Harper stepped toward him, thrusting the Bible in his face. Confess, heathen. Admit the devil works through you, and repent before your soul is damned for eternity. Kofi's lips curled in the faintest of smiles. His voice, calm, cut through the preacher's thunder. I do not fear your book. My ancestors walk with me. My gods hear me. You bring no light, only fire that consumes your own. Harper's face darkened. He flung holy water across Kofi's chest, shouting verses louder. The slaves gasped as the liquid sizzled on his skin, steam rising as though flesh burned. But Kofi did not flinch. He only whispered words in his own tongue, his voice steady, rising in rhythm. The air grew heavy. The torches bent in the wind, though no breeze stirred. The overseers shifted nervously, clutching their guns, and then, without warning, one torch exploded. Flames leapt high, racing across the circle. Slaves screamed. Overseers staggered back, the fire spreading faster than any man could explain. The preacher shouted, waving his Bible, Satan resists us. Stand firm, stand firm! But the fire twisted unnaturally, curling toward him like a living thing. His coat caught alight, flames racing up his arm. He screamed, dropping the Bible, flailing wildly. Edward rushed forward, trying to smother the flames, but the fire licked across the ground as though chasing them. The slaves broke into chaos. Some ran for water, others fell to their knees, wailing prayers. But through it all, Kofi remained motionless. His chains clattered softly as his body trembled with unseen power, his voice rising louder, the strange syllables striking the air like drumbeats. At last, the fire died as suddenly as it had come, leaving smoke curling into the sky. The preacher lay in the dirt, his face blackened, his chest rising shallowly. His voice, once booming, rasped in broken gasps. The devil, he is here, and he wears your chains. Then he was silent. The slaves stared at Kofi with wide eyes, awe and fear battling in their faces. The overseers looked to Edward, waiting for orders he could not give. His lips trembled, his mind spinning, but no words came. Kofi lifted his head. His eyes, dark as the swamp at midnight, swept the yard, and though his voice was soft, every ear heard it clearly. He cannot save you. None of them can. The spirits are stronger than your whips, your guns, your prayers, and they have marked you, Edward Tilling. The name struck like a curse itself. Edward staggered back, fury and terror mingling in his chest. He shouted for the slaves to return to their quarters, for the overseers to restore order, but the fire had already burned more than wood. It had burned his authority to ash. That night no man slept. The slaves whispered louder than ever. The voodoo man has broken the preacher. Even the white man's God has no power here. And Edward Tilling, clutching a bottle with trembling hands, stared into the dark corners of his house and wondered how much. The fire had scorched more than wood. It had burned away the last fragments of certainty that Edward Tilling clung to. The preacher's scream still echoed in his ears, louder than the crack of any whip he'd ever swung. Now the plantation lived in whispers and fear. Overseers walked with pale faces, rifles clutched tighter than ever. Some had already vanished, fleeing in the night, never to return. Those who remained muttered of spirits and demons, of curses no bullet could kill. The slaves carried themselves differently. They still bent their backs in the fields, still bore the weight of chains, but their eyes burned with something Edward had never seen before. Defiance. It was quiet, steady, a strength no lash could break. They moved in rhythm with one another, and always their gazes drifted to Kofi, and Kofi. He remained calm, silent, as if the world unraveling around them was nothing more than the turning of a season. But it was Edward's house that suffered most. It began with sounds. Footsteps in empty hallways, doors creaking though no wind stirred. At night, Edward heard whispers seeping from the walls, voices too faint to understand, but heavy with venom. Sometimes it was his name they hissed. Other times it was laughter, low, cruel, echoing in the dark. One night he woke to find the rocking chair in his room moving, creaking back and forth, though no hand touched it. Another night, his reflection in the mirror lingered a second longer than he moved, its lips curling into a smile his own face did not wear. Sleep became impossible. He drank to numb his nerves, but even then the visions grew stronger. He saw shadows moving through the halls, tall, twisting figures that vanished when he blinked. He smelled smoke when no fire burned, and always when silence pressed too hard, he heard the faint beat of drums rolling in from the swamp. His servants abandoned him. One woman swore she saw a figure at the end of the hallway, its eyes glowing like coals, and fled screaming into the night. Another man, loyal for years, hung himself in the barn after claiming the devil had taken residence in the house. Edward stormed to the slave quarters in rage, dragging Kofi out by the chains. He slammed him against the dirt, spittle flying as he shouted, "You think you frighten me? You think your tricks will break me? I am master here, not you." Kofi's calm eyes met his. "Master?" he murmured. "A master who trembles in his own house? A master haunted by the dead he buried beneath these fields? No, Edward Tilling, you are not master here. The land remembers. The spirits remember." Edward struck him with the butt of his pistol, desperate to drown the words, but they only echoed louder in his head. That night, the hauntings worsened. He was awoken by screams, not human, but animal. He rushed to the stables to find horses foaming at the mouth, thrashing wildly, their eyes white and unseeing. Within moments, 3 were dead, their bodies stiff, their mouths twisted in silent terror. The dogs turned next. Once loyal protectors, they now snarled when Edward approached, their hackles rising, their teeth bared. One lunged, biting deep into his arm before overseers pulled it away. Edward ordered the animal shot, but when the bullet struck, the dog did not fall. It stood trembling, growling, blood dripping from its jaws until finally it dropped lifeless in the dirt by dawn. Whispers spread like wildfire. The animals themselves had turned against the master. Inside his house, the walls seemed alive. Scratches appeared on the wood, claw marks gouged deep into the plaster. Edward scrubbed them away, but by morning they returned, darker, deeper, as though something inside was clawing its way out. One evening, stumbling through his halls with a bottle in hand, he saw her, his wife, dead these many years. She stood at the end of the corridor, pale and still, her eyes hollow. Her lips parted as if to speak, but only blood poured out, thick and black, dripping to the floor. Edward staggered forward, reaching for her, but she dissolved into smoke before his eyes. He fell to his knees, screaming into the empty hallway. By now, even the overseers no longer looked to Edward for command. They whispered of leaving him to his fate, of abandoning the cursed plantation before the swamp swallowed them all. Edward clung to fury, the only weapon left to him. He paced his house like a madman, pistol always loaded, convinced shadows lurked in every corner. His once grand estate now reeked of rot, its halls thick with dread. And through it all, Kofi remained silent, waiting. Each night the drums grew louder. Each day, Edward's authority slipped further. His land was no longer his slaves no longer his, even his own house no longer his. The shadows had claimed it, and deep in the swamp, where moonlight touched water black as glass, Kofi whispered to the spirits once more, "The time draws near." Edward Tilling had reached his breaking point. The shadows in his home, the whispers in the fields, the endless thrum of unseen drums, all of it pressed on him like a weight he could not bear. His nights were sleepless, his days fevered. His face grew gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking, and in his fevered mind, one thought burned clear: kill Kofi, end the curse. The decision struck him in the dead of night, while pacing his study with a bottle of whiskey in hand. His reflection in the window sneered back at him, whispering in a voice not his own. It began with him. It will end with him. Edward slammed the bottle down. Tomorrow at dawn, Kofi would die. The gathering, he ordered every slave dragged from the quarters, overseers forming a ring around them with rifles drawn. The morning air was heavy, the swamp fog creeping in thick, curling around the gathered crowd like ghostly fingers. Kofi was shoved forward, chains rattling. Yet he walked calmly, shoulders straight, eyes unafraid. He stood before Edward as though the noose waiting for him was nothing more than another day's labor. Edward climbed onto the wooden platform, pistol at his side, sweat glistening down his face though the air was cool. "You think you've cursed me?" Edward spat, his voice trembling. "You think your heathen tricks make you stronger than me? No, today it ends. You die, and with you, your devil's work dies too." The crowd of slaves said nothing, but their eyes, their burning, watchful eyes, stayed fixed on Kofi. Kofi raised his head. "You can kill this body," he said softly, "but you cannot kill what has already begun." His words rippled through the crowd, chilling even the overseers who gripped their rifles tighter. Edward's fury flared. He motioned to the noose. "Hang him." The attempt, they forced Kofi onto the platform, slipping the rope around his neck. Still he did not resist. His lips moved silently, whispering words Edward could not hear, though the wind carried them faintly. Strange, rhythmic syllables that seemed to hum in the bones. "Enough." Edward roared. "Pull the lever!" The trapdoor opened. The rope snapped taut, and then it broke. The thick hemp, tested and strong, shredded like old straw. Kofi dropped to the ground, landing on his feet, the broken rope dangling uselessly. Gasps erupted. Overseers froze. The slaves murmured in low, rising voices, their eyes wide with awe. Edward's face turned pale. "Again," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Do it again!" Another rope was fetched, thicker than the first. Kofi was dragged up once more, the noose tied tight. The lever was pulled. Again, the rope broke. This time, before Kofi even hit the ground, thunder rolled through the clear morning sky. The sound shook the earth beneath their feet, though no clouds hung above. The slaves raised their voices louder, their murmurs swelling into a chant Edward could not understand. Panic flickered across the overseers' faces. Edward, shaking with rage, pulled his pistol. "Then I'll do it myself." He aimed at Kofi's head and fired. The gun exploded in his hand. The pistol shattered, the blast ripping across Edward's palm, blood splattering his face. He screamed, clutching his ruined hand. His ears rang with the echo of the shot. But when he looked, Kofi still stood unharmed. Chains clinked softly as Kofi stepped forward. "Calm as death itself. You see Edward Tilling," Kofi said, his voice carrying across the plantation. "This land itself has chosen. Every whip you cracked, every back you scarred, every body you buried, they are not forgotten. They rise now, and you cannot kill what has already risen." The slaves erupted into their chant, louder now, their voices like a storm breaking. Overseers backed away, some crossing themselves, others whispering prayers. Fear spread through them like fire in dry grass. Edward, wild-eyed, staggered back, clutching his bleeding hand. His voice broke into a scream. "Devil! Witch! You'll burn!" But the only answer was the steady beat of the slaves' chant, and the distant echo of drums rolling through the swamp. The retreat by dusk. Edward had locked himself in his mansion, bandaging his ruined hand with trembling fingers. He paced like a trapped animal, haunted by what he had seen. His overseers whispered outside, many already packing to leave. The slaves walked the fields in eerie silence, their chant still lingering in the air, as though carried by the wind itself. And Kofi? He returned to his place among them, no longer just a man, but a symbol. A living proof that the curse was real, that the spirit stood with him. Edward could not kill him. And deep down, Edward knew he never would. The curse was no longer just Kofi's. It was the land's. It was the dead's. It was his own. The plantation was no longer the same. Where once the overseer's whistle cut through the morning air, now silence hung heavy. The overseers, the men who had barked orders and swung whips, no longer dared to approach the fields. Some had already fled in the night, carrying what they could, refusing to face the curse they swore had taken root. Edward Tilling, with his ruined hand wrapped in blood-stained cloth, paced his mansion like a caged beast. His face was pale, eyes wild, lips whispering fragments of prayers that seemed to wither as soon as they left his mouth. He hadn't slept in days. Every shadow seemed alive. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards echoed like footsteps that didn't belong. From the windows, he could see them, the slaves, moving through the fields, not hurried, not beaten, not broken. They walked, slowly, deliberately, as though the land itself now belonged to them. And in the evenings, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the sound of drums drifted from the swamp. The overseers whispered among themselves, their fear raw. "It's not natural," one muttered. "No rope will hold him. No bullet will strike him. He's protected." And though they did not say his name aloud, they all knew who they meant. Kofi. Among his people, Kofi sat in the center of the quarters that night, surrounded by firelight and faces that glowed with a mix of fear and hope. The children huddled close, eyes wide, as their parents whispered stories of the day the noose broke, of the gun that turned against its master. "He walks with the spirits," one of the older women murmured, clutching a necklace of carved bones. "They cannot touch him," another whispered. "He is the sign we prayed for." Kofi did not smile. He did not boast. He sat silently, his eyes reflecting the flames, his voice calm when he finally spoke. "This is not about me," he said. "It is about all of us, about the lives taken, the backs scarred, the children stolen. Their cries are louder than chains, and the earth itself hears them. The curse is not mine alone. It belongs to every soul who suffered here." The words sank into them, filling the room like fire spreading through dry grass. For the first time, they saw not just survival, but possibility. Edward's isolation. Meanwhile, Edward's mind frayed further. He ordered the overseers to restore order, to beat the slaves back into submission. But the overseers hesitated. One man shook his head. "Sir, I've seen them ropes snap. I've seen your pistol burst. This ain't just rebellion. It's something else." Edward's face contorted with rage. "You cowards, they're slaves. They're nothing without us." But his words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. The overseers exchanged uneasy looks. Some left that very night, taking their horses and never returning. The plantation, once alive with the cruel rhythm of labor, was falling into silence. The cane rotted in the fields. The tools lay unused. The slaves no longer bowed when Edward appeared at the windows. They looked back at him, their stares steady, unflinching. Edward began to drink more heavily, clutching his Bible with trembling hands, muttering scripture to ward off the creeping dread. But the verses gave him no comfort. The voices in the halls grew louder, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Kofi's gaze, calm, unafraid, staring back. The swamp drums. The slaves gathered often at the edge of the swamp now. Fires burned late into the night, their chants rolling through the air like thunder. What once would have been punished with lashes was now unstoppable. The overseers dared not interrupt. The swamp, already feared for its snakes and quicksand, now seemed haunted. Strange lights flickered between the trees. The sound of drums echoed even when no fire was lit. And in the center of it all, Kofi stood, not as a man in chains, but as something larger. The curse was no longer a whispered story. It was alive. The breaking point one night, Edward stormed to the balcony, his face flushed with rage and drink. From across the fields, he could see them dancing around the fires, their shadows flickering, their voices rising in waves. The beat of the drums pounded in his skull. "Silence!" he screamed, though his voice was swallowed by the distance. "You will not take this from me. This land is mine. You are mine." But his words vanished into the night, meaningless against the tide of voices that no longer feared him. He slammed his bleeding fist against the railing, teeth gritted. But when he turned, he froze. A figure stood at the edge of the swamp, illuminated by the firelight. Kofi. Even from across the distance, Edward could see his eyes, dark, steady, unyielding. The air between them seemed to hum. Edward stumbled back, clutching his chest, as though the stare alone pressed against him like a weight. And then Kofi raised his hand. Just a small gesture, but enough. The drums roared louder, the chants rose higher, and the fires blazed as though the night itself had bent to him. Edward collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his hand clutching at his heart. The rise of courage that night, in the quarters, the slaves spoke not of survival, but of freedom. They whispered plans, not of running, but of standing, of taking what was theirs. "The curse has already broken him," one man said. "He cannot touch us now," another whispered. "This is our time." Kofi listened, silent, his face calm, but his eyes alight with something fierce. He did not need to tell them what to do. The fear that had bound them for generations was breaking on its own. The overseers were gone. The master was crumbling. And the slaves, for the first time, felt the weight of power shift into their hands. The fear that once chained them was now Edward's alone, and with every beat of the swamp's drums, the curse tightened around his soul. Edward Tilling had become a ghost long before his death. His skin clung to his bones, his eyes sunken deep, his ruined hands swollen and infected. He no longer left his mansion. The great halls that once echoed with his commands now rang only with his mutterings, his screams in the night, and the constant slam of doors that opened when no wind blew. Servants whispered of seeing him wander the halls, speaking to shadows, bargaining with things no one else could see. His Bible, once gripped so tightly, now lay open and forgotten, its pages damp with spilled liquor. The overseers were gone. The slaves no longer worked. And yet Edward remained, pacing, trembling, waiting for something he knew was coming. The final night it was a night heavy with storm clouds, thunder rumbling in the distance. The swamp drums pounded louder than ever before, carried across the fields with a force that rattled Edward's windows. He staggered to the balcony, his face pale as bone, staring across the darkened fields. Fires burned in the swamp, dozens of them, their glow flickering like 100 eyes watching him. The chants rolled with the thunder, rising, falling, rising again, until they drowned out even his thoughts. And then he saw him, Kofi, standing at the edge of the swamp, firelight painting his features, calm and unyielding. His presence was not loud, not violent, but it was absolute. Edward's lips trembled. No, this is my land, mine. His knees gave way. He collapsed on the balcony floor, clawing at the boards as the voices swelled. His chest heaved, pain splitting through his ribs. He tried to call for help, but there was no one left to answer. He crawled back inside, gasping, sweat dripping down his face. His vision blurred. The shadows in the corners moved, twisting into shapes he could not name. The walls whispered his sins back to him, every lash, every body buried, every scream silenced. They surrounded him now. The house itself seemed alive, every floorboard groaning with the weight of judgment. "Mercy," Edward begged, his voice breaking. "Please. Mercy." But the only reply was a low hum, a steady drumbeat in his chest that wasn't his own. And then it stopped. His body collapsed, his last breath torn from him in silence. Death without rest. Edward Tilling was buried in the family plot behind the mansion, the grave dug in haste by trembling hands. His coffin was lowered into the earth, the lid nailed shut, the dirt packed heavy, but peace did not come. That very night, the slaves whispered they heard him screaming beneath the ground. The earth itself seemed to shake with his agony. Some claimed they saw the soil shift, as though something inside clawed to get out. The overseers who had stayed fled in terror. Within days the mansion stood empty, the plantation abandoned to weeds and silence. But still, the screams lingered. The haunting travelers who passed near the Carolina swamp in the years that followed spoke of strange sounds at night. They heard a man's voice crying out in torment, echoing through the trees. Some claimed to see a figure pacing the balcony of the ruined mansion, clutching his chest, his face twisted in agony. Others swore they saw the ground at his grave shift and heave as though the earth refused to keep him. No priest could bless it, no prayer could quiet it. Edward Tilling had died, but rest was denied him, Kofi's legacy. And Kofi? Some say he vanished into the swamp the night of Edward's death, never seen again. Others claimed he remained among the people, guiding them, teaching them, until freedom came years later. But all agreed on one thing: the curse had been fulfilled. Edward Tilling's name became a whisper of fear, a warning of cruelty repaid. And Kofi became something more than a man. He was a legend, the Voodoo man of Carolina, the spirit who cursed his master to a death without rest, the one who proved that even the mightiest could fall when the dead themselves demanded justice. The legend lives even generations later, when the mansion rotted into ruins and vines swallowed the fields. People avoided the land. Hunters said their dogs refused to cross the property line. Children dared,